In August 1943, a Soviet fighter pilot disappeared over the Eastern Front. She was 21 years old. She had shot down 12 German aircraft. She had painted a white lily on her plane. The Germans called her the White Rose of Stalingrad. The Soviet Union called her something else. They called her a deserter. They declared her a traitor. They erased her name from the records. It took 47 years to get it back. Lydia Vladimirovna Litvyak was born in Moscow in 1921. Her father was a railway worker. Her mother was a seamstress. They lived in a communal apartment on Novosibirskaya Street, the kind of Moscow childhood that was ordinary in every way except one. At 14, Lydia Litvyak decided she was going to fly, not as a passenger, not as a dream. She enrolled in the Kherson Flight School while still a schoolgirl, lying about her age to get in. She had her pilot's license before she had finished school. By the time she was 18, she was a flight instructor at the Kalinin Aviation Club, teaching men twice her age to do something she had taught herself to do at 14. She was 5'3". She weighed less than 50 kilograms. She had blonde hair and a habit of picking wildflowers to put in her cockpit. Her students called her Lilia. Everything about her appearance suggested someone who should not be trusted with a fighter aircraft. Everything about her flying suggested the opposite. June 22, 1941. Germany invades. Lydia Litvyak is 19 years old and already a qualified pilot with 100 hours of flight time. She goes to the military recruitment office immediately. They send her home. Too young, too small, too female. She comes back with forged documents showing 500 hours of flight time instead of 100. She is accepted into the 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment, one of 3 all-female aviation units formed by the legendary Soviet aviator Marina Raskova. The Night Witches flew bombers. Litvyak wanted something faster. She wanted to fight. The 586th flew Yak-1 fighters, fast, agile, deadly in the right hands. Litvyak's hands were exactly the right kind. Her commanding officer, Major Tamara Kazarinova, noted in an early assessment that Litvyak flew with, quote, an instinctive aggression unusual in pilots of any experience level. Instinctive aggression. In a Yak-1 fighter over the Eastern Front in 1942, instinctive aggression was the difference between coming home and not coming home. Lydia Litvyak came home, repeatedly, and she started painting a white lily on her fuselage. Nobody told her to do this. Nobody approved it. It was simply something she did, a personal mark on a military machine, a declaration of individual identity in a system that preferred soldiers to be interchangeable. The Germans noticed the white lily. They noticed it because the plane with the white lily kept appearing in their formations and their pilots kept not returning. In September 1942, Litvyak was transferred to the 437th Fighter Aviation Regiment operating over Stalingrad. This was not a reward. This was the front that was consuming the Soviet Air Force, the way Stalingrad was consuming everything else. By attrition, by overwhelming German numbers, by the simple mathematics of how many aircraft each side could lose before running out. She arrived as one of several female pilots integrated into male regiments, an experiment in necessity, born from the fact that the Soviet Air Force was running out of experienced pilots, and Litvyak was demonstrably more experienced than many of the men they had left. On September 13, 1942, 2 days after her arrival, Lydia Litvyak shot down her first German aircraft. It was a Bf-109, the primary German fighter, fast, well-armed, flown by experienced Luftwaffe pilots who had been flying combat missions since 1939. Litvyak had been at the Stalingrad front for 48 hours. What happened next has become one of the more remarkable stories in the history of air combat. The pilot she shot down, a German Luftwaffe officer, was captured after bailing out. He was brought to the Soviet airfield. He was furious. He demanded to know which pilot had shot him down, insisting that the engagement had been conducted by a highly experienced, exceptionally skilled opponent who had outmaneuvered him in ways he had not experienced before. He expected to be taken to meet a veteran ace, a man with years of combat experience, someone whose skill level could explain what had just happened to him. They brought him Lydia Litvyak. She was 21 years old. She was 5'3". She was still covered in the grime of the sortie. According to Soviet witnesses, the German officer stared at her for a long moment. Then he confirmed, in disbelief, that yes, this was the pilot who had shot him down. He identified the specific maneuvers she had used. She confirmed them. He reportedly said nothing further. She shot down another German aircraft the same day. By the end of 1942, Lydia Litvyak had become something the Soviet military had not planned for and did not entirely know how to handle. A genuine fighter ace who was also a young woman with flowers in her cockpit and a white lily painted on her plane. The propaganda department wanted to use her. Her story was extraordinary. The blonde female pilot shooting down German aces over Stalingrad. It wrote itself. But using her story required acknowledging her story. And acknowledging her story meant acknowledging that the Soviet military had systematically tried to exclude her at every stage. The recruitment office that turned her away, the forged flight hours, the resistance to female pilots in combat roles. The propaganda department used her story anyway, selectively, in the approved format. Litvyak ignored the propaganda department and kept flying. The White Lily became known. German pilots over Stalingrad began reporting it, the small yak one with the white flower on the fuselage that appeared without warning and was gone before you could respond. The Germans called her die Weiße Rose von Stalingrad, the White Rose of Stalingrad. They had her flower wrong. It was a lily, not a rose. But they had her right in every other way. She was exactly what they said she was, a pilot of exceptional skill operating over Stalingrad with a personal marking that made her identifiable and that she refused to remove despite the tactical disadvantage of being recognizable. She kept the lily because the lily was hers. In a war that was trying very hard to make everyone interchangeable, Lydia Litvyak insisted on being specifically herself. The air war over Stalingrad and then the Kuban region in 1943 was the most intense aerial combat of the entire Eastern Front campaign. The Luftwaffe committed its best units. The Soviet Air Force committed everything it had. Lydia Litvyak flew through all of it. She was wounded twice. She was shot down once and crash-landed behind Soviet lines, walking back to her regiment. She watched her friends die in numbers that accumulated across the months, pilots she had trained with, flown with, lived with in the cramped conditions of forward airfields. And she fell in love. His name was Alexei Solomatin. He was a Soviet fighter pilot, a squadron commander, one of the most experienced combat pilots in the regiment. They met at Stalingrad. They flew together. They were, by the accounts of everyone who knew them, completely and specifically suited to each other in the way that two people who understand the same extreme thing sometimes are. On May 21, 1943, Alexei Solomatin was killed in a mid-air collision during a training exercise. Litvyak flew combat missions the following day. She did not stop flying. She flew more aggressively after his death than before it, which those who knew her said was not grief expressed as recklessness, but something more controlled, a decision made consciously that the work was what remained and the work would be done with full commitment. By the summer of 1943, Lydia Litvyak had 12 confirmed aerial victories, individual German aircraft shot down in single combat. This made her the highest-scoring female fighter pilot in the history of aviation, a record she holds to this day. 12. In less than a year of combat flying. For context, the threshold for being classified as a fighter ace in the Soviet Air Force was 5 confirmed kills. Litvyak had more than double the ace threshold. She had achieved in months what many experienced male pilots never achieved in years. On July 19, 1943, she was wounded in combat, shrapnel to the leg. She refused evacuation. She flew the next day with her leg bandaged. Her regiment commander ordered her to rest. She flew anyway. August 1, 1943. The Mius Front, southern Russia. A large aerial engagement involving dozens of Soviet and German aircraft. Lydia Litvak's Yak-1 was seen going into a steep dive after being hit. Several Soviet pilots witnessed it. One reported seeing her aircraft smoking. Another reported seeing it level out briefly before diving again. No one saw it hit the ground. No one saw her bail out. She was 21 years old. She did not come back. What happened next is the part of this story that makes it different from every other story about a pilot who didn't come back. In the chaos of the 1943 air campaign, pilots went missing regularly. The standard procedure was to list them as missing in action, continue the investigation as long as resources allowed, and eventually, if no further information emerged, close the file with an official designation. The Soviet military did not do this with Lydia Litvyak. Instead, in the weeks following her disappearance, her file was reviewed at a level above her regiment. And the designation that was applied to her was not missing in action. It was deserter. Let me be precise about what this means. Desertion in the Soviet military during wartime carried the death penalty. It was the most serious charge that could be applied to a soldier. It meant that the person had deliberately abandoned their post and their comrades, the ultimate military betrayal. Lydia Litvyak had 12 confirmed aerial victories. She had been wounded multiple times. She had continued flying when ordered to rest. She had refused evacuation after being hit in combat. And the Soviet military designated her a deserter. Why? The honest answer is that the full documentation of the decision has never been released. What researchers have pieced together from partial records suggests several possible factors. First, no wreckage was immediately found. In the bureaucratic logic of the Soviet military, a pilot who could not be proven dead could theoretically have chosen not to be dead, could have landed in German territory and surrendered. The absence of a body was treated not as evidence of an unknown fate, but as evidence of a suspicious one. Second, Litvyak had been difficult, not insubordinate. Her combat record was too exceptional for that charge to stick, but persistently individual. The white lily, the flowers in the cockpit, the refusal to stop flying when ordered. In a military culture that valued conformity, she had been a consistent exception. Third, and this is the factor that researchers have found most significant, there were witnesses who reported seeing her aircraft level out after being hit. In the Soviet military's interpretation, a pilot who could level out had a choice. A pilot who had a choice and did not return had made a choice. None of this logic holds up under examination. But it did not need to hold up. It needed to produce a file designation. And it did. Her family was not told she had died. They were told she had deserted. Her mother, Anna Litvyak, spent years trying to find out what had happened to her daughter. She was given no information. The file was classified. The designation was final. Lydia Litvyak, 12 aerial victories, the highest-scoring female fighter pilot in history, the White Rose of Stalingrad, was officially a traitor. And then the Soviet Union buried her the way it buried everything inconvenient. In paperwork. For 47 years, Lydia Litvyak did not officially exist. She existed in the memories of pilots who had flown with her, in the accounts of witnesses who had seen her fly, in the testimony of the German officer she had shot down over Stalingrad, who confirmed to his captors that, yes, this small blonde woman had outflown him completely. She existed in the diary of a fellow pilot named Inna Pasportnikova, who had been Litvyak's closest friend and who spent decades after the war trying to clear her name. She existed in the accounts of local villagers near the Mius Front who, years after the war, reported finding the wreckage of a Soviet aircraft and the remains of a pilot in a field outside the village of Dmitrievka. The Soviet authorities were notified. Nothing happened. In 1979, a Soviet journalist named Yuri Berezhnoy began investigating the Litvyak case. He found the witnesses. He found the villager accounts. He found the partial records that showed the desertion designation had been applied without adequate investigation. He published his findings. Nothing happened. In 1988, the wreckage near Dmitrievka was formally excavated. The remains of a Soviet pilot were found. The aircraft was identified as a Yak-1. Personal items recovered from the site were consistent with Litvak's known belongings. The Soviet military reviewed the case. In 1990, 47 years after she disappeared, 47 years after her family was told she was a deserter, 47 years after the white lily was painted over in the official record, the Soviet Union formally rehabilitated Lydia Litvyak. The desertion designation was removed. She was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, posthumously. Her mother Anna had died in 1986, 4 years before the rehabilitation. She never knew. Sources are in the description, the combat records, the rehabilitation documentation, and Inna Pasportnikova's account of the 47-year campaign to clear Litvak's name. That campaign is its own story. A woman spending 47 years fighting a bureaucracy to restore the reputation of her dead friend. I did not have room for it in this video. It deserves its own. Subscribe if you're new. That story is coming. And if anyone ever tells you that what you paint on your plane doesn't matter, tell them about the white lily. It was still there when they found the wreckage. 45 years later. Still there.